live stream. And so my goal of this is just to kind of try to stay connected with folks, just to kind of put some things out there, maybe some different tips and tricks and strategies and just different things to think about when you might be working, whether it's in a journal or on works of art. And so today, as I was kind of thinking right before I went live, like, okay, what am I going to focus on today? Because I kind of like sharing like little tips and things like that, just some things that maybe you haven't thought about, or maybe you've thought about or done in the past, but sometimes it's always great to have a little bit of a reminder. And I was kind of looking around my little studio space here, and I have some smaller pieces of art. I mean, I've had to take my studio and move it from my one car garage, which is pretty big, and I have several tables and lots of counters out there. But um, a year ago, when the pandemic hit and I started doing live streaming, well, I don't have Wi-Fi out in the garage, so I had to move stuff inside. And so I'm in this kind of little space, which is part of the bedroom, and it just basically means I don't have that big, huge space. So I still have that garage full of materials, full of stuff, but in this little space, I've got a little 4-foot table here that I'm working on. And I've got a bookshelf behind me that holds some of my stuff. So I don't have a lot of space. I can't do really big things. So I've been working a lot on smaller papers, a lot of smaller pieces. And so I wanted to kind of share a way that you could start working on something small, but at the same time, sort of inadvertently add to a journal page. It's a real simple idea, but I always love the effect that it has. So it's kind of like using the journal like a placemat. So instead of food, it's going to get paint and other stuff on it. So it keeps your work surface clean if that matters to you. I mean, my work surface, I don't really care if it gets dirty. I mean, it's an art table, so it's all stained up anyway. But it's almost like, oh, all that paint and stuff that gets on the table is almost a waste. So what if I could do something where I could use that? So that's kind of what I want to focus on today. So if you're tuning in and you want to pop into the comments and say hi, great. If you want to follow along and do something similar, that's fine. Or if you just kind of want to watch, or if you're just working on something totally different, remember, this is not about like, oh, monkey see, monkey do. You don't have to copy or mimic or do what I do. But anyway, let me go ahead and switch over, and I'll talk about the paper that I have and kind of how I'm going to use my journal as this like placemat. All right, so I've got my journal, and I've got different sizes paper. I've been really loving working on the small 4-inch by 4-inch paper. Let me go ahead, and that looks to be a little bit bright. Let me knock the light back a little bit. There you go. Okay, so I've been really loving working on these small 4-inch by 4-inch papers. It's just really a quick, easy way to work through ideas. It's actually one of the things that I'm going to be sharing in my free workshop that's coming up this week. Actually, I started on Friday. So I have one here that's totally blank, but I have a couple that I've started and haven't really done anything with. And then I've got a few pieces, or a couple pieces of bigger paper. This is a 7-inch by 7-inch, and then this is an 8-inch by 8-inch. And this is just mixed media paper. So the idea is, if I'm, kind of starting something, I can add to a page by, excuse me, by allowing this to kind of be, like I said, a placemat. So the idea is pretty simple. I put down my piece of paper and I grab my paints. I've got my paints over here. I've got my paper. And so I'm going to just start something off. It doesn't have to be anything too specific, but putting it on my journal page, my journal spread, means that I can paint right to the edge. And sometimes I purposely, like, okay, I'm really going to paint to that edge, and purposely get paint onto my journal page. But this is a great way to allow me to get to the edge of my paper, to add some things, and the paint gets onto the journal page. And so I just added a little bit of paint there. I want to let that dry. So I can take this and I can set it off to the side. I can let it start to dry. But then I have this little bit of paint there, so I could do that with each of my papers. Now this one was a little bit smaller than the last, and maybe I'll use a different color. Maybe I'll use this turquoise. And again, just kind of letting it go off the edge. It's like I said, it's not like not a groundbreaking thing. It's just kind of, sometimes we don't think about doing something like this. And so by using the smaller paper, it's smaller than my journal. And then I can just quickly add, start work. So, these smaller pieces are going to be standalone pieces of art, but I can start a journal page too. So I have these inadvertent marks. I have these marks on there that, they're just kind of random, and then things can get really interesting whenever I go a little bit smaller. So maybe I'll use this one. Like I said, if you are tuning in and you want to say hi in the comments, great. So Linda, welcome, welcome. And Holly, thank you so much for tuning in. So again, just like real quick, now I've got that started. I can set that aside to dry. And I use a hair dryer a lot whenever I'm painting to like quickly dry stuff. But I find that, it's really interesting though, sometimes to work on multiple pieces. And so this is an easy way that I can jump around between or among a few pieces and get some things started. And then, it's like I'm starting to get this interesting buildup on my journal page here. And so this is just a quick, easy, interesting way to get something down. And, I'm not worrying about getting my surface dirty. And then the page, I'm taking the blankness away. So yeah, I'm using watercolor, which is a standard thing that I do a lot, is to use watercolor to start pages. And that helps take the blankness away. But this is sort of a random process, so I've got this space now that's begun in this way. And it's just this really interesting thing. And if I do that over and over again, I can really get this page marked up a lot. And I've got a page, actually I have a few pages, but let me go ahead. Here's one that I've kind of done. And I haven't done much to this. And you can see how I have all these little marks. So I think this was just a index card. So even though index cards aren't the best materials for painting, maybe I'm going to make collage material. So that's another thing you can think about, is like, I've got my index cards. It's not the best paper to do finish work on, but maybe I want to have some painted papers for later. So let me go ahead and turn back. I mean, I could use this, but I want to go back to this page, wherever it was. Oh no, I know where it was. It was in some notes. So I had square papers. Now, what if I have a rectangular paper? So I hadn't really thought about that before, but it's like, instead of thinking about like, oh, I'm doing finished work, what if I'm doing painted papers that I want to use as collage materials? And so the index cards are going to be perfect for that. They're real thin, they curl, but they'll dry. I'm just going to lay it over there. And if it gets paint on that paper, it's not a big deal. Maybe I'm going to do a different color. Let's do red. So yeah, so that paper got so wet that it curled up, but it'll dry, it'll become flat. It's kind of interesting. So again, this is just the index card paper. Oh, I have writing on that one. Oh well. But like I said, this can easily become some collage material, and that's kind of the idea. Maybe let's do the primaries. Do yellow, red, and blue. And then, you know, that's adding. Let's see if any of my other papers are dry. This isn't totally dry, but maybe I'll do some splattering on it. The interesting thing with the splattering, if I do it a lot and I really want to cover it, then I'll have a void on the paper on my page there. Maybe I like the splattering, so I could get like real intentional, like, oh, I'm going to do down here, and maybe I'll do some splattering with a different color. So some of that's still wet, and then the paint starting to bleed and run and do some interesting things. So, but yeah, that's just kind of a quick and easy way to start getting something going on a page that's totally random, very inadvertent. And like I was saying, it's almost like that notion that it's a placemat. And so I'm gonna keep from getting paint everywhere, but I'm gonna use my journal. And then, you know, I don't have to worry about it getting on the table. But you know, that's kind of an interesting feel to that. And so that's one thing that I find interesting. There's another thing that I do that's very similar, and I want to share that. Actually, I'm going to pull out a paper that I have back here. So this one has a lot of random stuff going on. And I try to keep this, or, you know, any kind of paper. This is a little thicker paper that I just had a scrap of. I was like, oh, that's a good size, because it's as long as my journal page. And the reason that that's good is that I can use this as wherever I have cutouts, you know. So if I'm flipping through and, you know, I have this cutout here. So let's say that I wanted to do something to this, but I didn't want to get paint on there. I could stick this underneath like that, do whatever I wanted here, and then that would protect the page underneath. So that's what I like about this, using this paper. So, you know, going through and finding those spaces where I may have cut out, like right here. So this is a good example, you know. So maybe I don't want to get anything on the elephant. So if I take this and put it underneath, then what I can do, maybe I'll go ahead and do some paint. Maybe I'll use this brown paint. You know, I'm going to paint it. And so that way I don't have to worry about trying to paint right up to the edge. And then it protects what's underneath, you know. So I have this little, it might be a little hard to see, but I kind of have this brown rectangle now that's kind of been superimposed on top of that. And so it just kind of helps protect what's underneath. And so it allows me to add and add and add around cutouts. So anywhere that I have a cutout, like on this one, it's cut down the middle, which might not be that big of a deal. But if I'm painting this, there's this little crack. So that could get in. And so I could take this and just stick it underneath. And so then that way, if I wanted to go ahead and use a different color on it, I'm not going to get paint on the face that's underneath it. So it just becomes this protective space. But because it gets paint on it and it has all this kind of weird stuff, and there's a little bit of pink there from where the paint got in between the cuts. So now this paper is really interesting. And this would be perfect if I'm, flipping through and I want to add to a blank space. I'm actually getting to the end of this book. But if I had a blank space I wanted to add to, so I could glue that in, I could cut this up. So I could flip through and find spaces to do that. So again, if I have a space where I'm like, oh, I want to protect it, stick it underneath, paint whatever I want to do, use ink, and then it's going to get on that instead of on what's underneath. So anyway, just a couple of ideas of how you could sort of inadvertently create something either directly on your pages or on a scrap paper that you could then use in your art or in your journal. I find that a very interesting kind of thing. And I'll do that with stencils too. I hadn't really planned all this out, but then it's always interesting to, like, as I'm working, like, oh, I thought about this. Oh, I could do that. So with stencils or with, let me find my box. So with like stencils or with other things, so I've got some stencils here. I've got my punchinella. So punchinella, which is also sequin waste. So I've got a couple pieces of that. So I'm always looking to be able to add to pages. So if I'm going to take this and say that I want to just paint, so I'll use some brown. So stencils aren't all that brilliant to use with paint, with watercolor paint. They're better with a thicker paint like acrylic paint. And the reason is that the paint's really runny and it runs underneath the stencil. So if you don't like that, you can actually use a sponge. So if I put the paint on a sponge and squeeze out all the water, then it's not as runny and it won't bleed and run underneath the stencil. But I like it to run under the stencil. I like that unpredictability, I guess that's a word. I like the unpredictable nature of it. And so when I pull it up, I mean, it's really it's bleeding, it's kind of messy, but now this is covered with paint. So what I do a lot of times is I just leave it dry, but what if I take it and turn it to a different page, a different spot? I don't know if out there. Trying to find, I now have brown on there, so I'll just go ahead and do here. It's a blank page. So if I lay it down, it's wet on the back, so I can get these like spots, but I can also take my paper towel. So this is just a little piece of paper towel. I'm going to moisten it just so it has a little bit of water because I'm going to clean my stencils. So I have used these and haven't cleaned them. So all of a sudden, all this dried watercolor paint is coming off of them. Then I can flip it over and do the same thing. So if you have stencils, you have things that you're like, oh, I need to wipe them off. I mean, that's a really cool background now. So I really like that. I really like how that turned out. And like I said, that was just because I haven't cleaned the stencil in a long time. Actually, I don't clean these very often either. So I'm just kind of wondering if I just wipe it and didn't add any paint, Yep, it's doing the same thing. So yeah, I don't clean, I don't clean these things very often. But now look at that, just kind of real interesting. So I've used these, and students have used these with acrylic. So there's dried acrylic on them. But just kind of an interesting thing. I mean, it's completely inadvertent. I mean, I wouldn't say it was completely unplanned because I knew like, okay, there's paint on it, and if I clean it, I know it's going to get some things down. But that's just a really great way to get some stuff going. So um, yeah, so think about that. Like as you're working, can you use your journal as a placemat? I mean, now that this is starting to dry, that's really interesting. I mean, it's completely random, but what it does, it takes that blankness away, and it gives me something to work on, to work with. And then as I layer and layer on top, those marks are going to stay. So it might, where this goes now might be really interesting because of all this kind of texture and lines and color that's underneath it. Let's see, where was that other one? Like in like this one, I've got all these little marks, and I haven't really done much to this yet, but this does have holes in it. So this will be a place where I can then use my other paper. So if you cut holes through your work or you cut pages and you've got these spaces where you're like, oh yeah, I don't want to get things on it, just put it down. Let's see, let's go ahead and do it while we're at it. So if you've tuned into some of the live streams before, or you've taken classes with me, one of the things that I do a lot is just sort of randomly flip through my journal and find spaces that I feel like, hey, I really, really want to do something to that page. It just kind of draws me in. And then what I'll do a lot is I'll sit down with a single material or a single idea. So, today I'm kind of focusing on using these inadvertent marks or things like that to build, to create. So as I'm flipping through now, so I got that green, but now I've got a little green circle there that matches that one that I did probably when I did that side. So it just really ends up having some really interesting things going on just with these inadvertent marks. And then also inadvertently, if your paper's thin, so this is sketch paper. It's a 60 or 65-pound paper. I use a Strathmore hardbound sketch journal. And so some of it does bleed through. So you might see like a yellowish, orangish color bleeding through. And that comes from this side. So what I was doing here bled through a little bit to the back. That drives some people crazy. To me, it's just like, oh, that's texture to work with. And so as I add on to this side, let's see, what do I want to use? Let's go ahead and use some orange. So as I add to this side, and then the reverse is going to happen. So some of this orange is going to start to soak in and maybe show up on the other side. But I've got some reds and some oranges over here, so it's going to kind of go with that. So I just accept that as part of the process, that it doesn't have to be a perfect thing. I don't have to get a journal that has really thick paper. And I kind of like the fact that like things will bleed through, and it really makes me have to deal with things that maybe I don't like. And so I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, why would you want to do that? And for me, I think it's more about being attached. So I think a lot of times we're attached to that things have to be like a certain way or have to be very perfect. So allowing chance and unpredictability into your work is a way to kind of let go of that attachment, to kind of deal with that, to try new things. So yeah, it's just a it's just a nice way to kind of invite a little bit of randomness and chance into your work, and allow it to allow yourself to deal with it, because either you deal with it or you ignore it, or you like fret about it, or you rip it out and throw it away. And I don't want to do that. I'm not going to rip pages out of my journal to throw them away because, oh well, that color bled through, or that pen bled through, or that paint kind of came through. It's just like, well, I kind of know with this paper that, yeah, that's going to happen. So anyway, I just kind of wanted to pop on and share some ideas, maybe just, just a different take on mark making. Just that notion that you can make marks without intentionally making marks, so that becomes the byproduct. The mark making becomes a byproduct of another process. So painting those little papers, whether it's for finished works of art or whether it's for collage materials, that just creates random lines and shapes and textures. It's a great way to get something going. It's a great way to kind of take the blankness away. And then using a separate paper to kind of uh, to keep cutouts and areas in your pages from getting paint on them, so to kind of block the paint. That's a great way to kind of, again, create some interesting, unpredictable things. And then finally, like this notion of being able to clean your stencils and your texture making tools. So, I mean, you could do that if you're using acrylic. It might be a little bit harder because the acrylic dries very quickly, but you know, when you paint with the acrylic, turn it over onto a blank paper, wipe it off, and that acrylic paint's going to wipe off and get all over your page and have some really interesting things going on. So, yeah, just kind of wanted to share some of that, and appreciate you tuning in. If you have any questions or any thoughts or anything like that, make sure that you put them in in the chat, in the comments, and I'll try to answer them for you. And then don't forget, I've got a free online workshop coming up. It starts this Friday. I'm going to do it through Facebook. So I have a Facebook group set up for it. That's where the lessons are going to take place live. I'm going to start on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock with just an intro, and then the main lessons will start on Saturday. And that's going to go all the way through the 31st, so next Wednesday. So it's about 5 days. Um, so you can sign up for that. It's totally free. That's on my website, and I'll send you an email with the information, and all the information is on my website too. But anyway, I appreciate you tuning in. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments or reach out to me. And thanks so much for joining me. And as always, happy creating.